Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I never thought I'd miss the small window in my cell. For nearly a year, I was locked in a juvenile facility meant for those who needed professional help. The place was labeled as a rehabilitation center, but to me, it was just a very grey, silent building with thick bars and an echoing hallway. And yet, that narrow beam of sunlight each morning was my only friend. I've replayed my crime 1,000 times in my head. It's the reason I ended up in that place. The staff called me dangerous. They said I needed to be separated from normal society. My official status, murderer. I still have trouble carrying that label, because I never woke up one day wanting to do the thing I did. But it happened, and no apology or regret can erase the fact that I took a life. I was only 15. The judge said I was too young to be tried as an adult, but too dangerous to go to a standard juvenile correction program. So they stuck me in a high-security mental institution for evaluation. I used to think being alone was the worst part. Then the zombie outbreak proved me wrong. The first sign something was really bad came from the orderlies. I caught snatches of frantic whispers, entire neighborhoods sealed off, people acting strangely. During group therapy, Dr. Whitley, our head psychiatrist, tried to pretend nothing out of the ordinary was happening in the world. She had a calm voice and a neat pen she always tapped on her clipboard, but her eyes kept darting toward the window behind us. She cancelled the session after only 10 minutes. I'd never seen her that scattered before. She guided us back to our rooms, told us to wait patiently, and vanished down the corridor. Later that evening, rumors drifted in through the staff. Someone said it was some kind of infection. It's spreading so fast, I heard an orderly mention. Hospital wards are over capacity. People act strange as soon as they're infected. That night, I lay on my cot with the thin blanket pulled over me, listening through the door. Beyond the walls, a security guard was shouting into his phone. Some bits came through. "No, they can't just seal us in. We have minors in here." Then static. Then the sound of footsteps, quick and nervous, receding down the hall. I tried to piece it all together. My facility was on the outskirts of the city, so we hardly got visitors, let alone gossip. TV privileges were rare, but whatever was happening sounded serious and close. The next morning, everything was different. The staff wore face masks. One nurse carried a makeshift plastic shield in front of her. I asked if there was a riot. She just mumbled, "Stay in your cell," and walked on, her eyes half wild. They initiated a total lockdown. The overhead lights flickered, and an announcement came on the crackling speakers. "Attention, all residents must remain in their assigned rooms. This is a precautionary measure. Do not attempt to leave. We are awaiting instructions from city officials." I shot to my feet and pressed my ear to the door. I heard kids protesting from all over the ward. Some were frightened, some furious. Even if they had done terrible things, nobody wanted to be caged during a crisis. I heard a siren in the distance. Then I heard a strange thumping on the walls. It might have been the staff trying to barricade certain entrances, but something about it felt desperate. Dr. Whitley's voice eventually blared through the speaker again, more urgent this time. "Remain calm. We have received reports of an outbreak of unknown origin. You are safe. We are taking every measure to protect you." But we weren't calm, not at all. The power went out late that afternoon. My only light came from that little window. The overhead bulbs flickered back on about 5 minutes later, but it was enough to rattle everyone. The hallway outside was filled with the sound of running footsteps, slamming doors, and the clang of a security gate. I paced my cell, eyes fixed on the tiny rectangle of glass near the ceiling. Grey clouds blanketed the sky, and I swore I saw something moving in the courtyard beyond. A shape, human maybe, lumbering in circles. I tried not to think about it. Instead, I remembered my crime. That's what I did whenever I got anxious or scared. I remembered exactly where I was, how it happened, the moment everything changed. I'm not going to spell it out here, in detail. I'll just say that I acted on rage, and it ended in tragedy. I didn't enjoy it, but I can't pretend it was an accident. Perhaps I was expecting that if the world was ending, then my punishment wouldn't matter anymore, that maybe I'd be free at last. But I never expected the path to freedom would be so haunting. Then the screams started in the evening. They echoed across the empty cafeteria, down the corridor, and into each of our cells. Those screams spoke of absolute panic. I jumped up from my cot, pressing my face against the cell door's narrow window. I saw a pair of orderlies rush by, fear etched on their faces. Behind them stumbled a figure in a tattered uniform. One of the orderlies was shouting, "Back, stay back!" But the figure did not stop. Its body moved with a jerking motion, as if it had forgotten how to walk. Its arms were outstretched, but there was something off about its eyes, glassy, vacant. The orderlies disappeared around the corner, and the figure followed. Then another shape came into view, a security guard. He clutched his side, breathing hard. Under the flickering lights, I glimpsed red droplets on his shirt. He frantically typed in the code to a locked steel door at the end of the hall. The door clicked open. The guard rushed through. The door clanged shut. That was the last I saw of him. Something big was happening. I could feel it rattling in my chest like a second heartbeat. Hours ticked by, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell in the gloom. At one point, the overhead lights flickered off completely, and the red emergency bulbs clicked on. That's when the real chaos began. I heard another scream, this time much closer. A nurse ran past my door. She was pale, trembling. She fumbled at the locks of each cell, shouting, "You have to leave! They're inside! Hurry!" The moment she reached my door, she jabbed a key into the metal lock, yanked the handle, and pulled it open. She was breathing so fast it sounded painful. I stumbled out, eyes adjusting to the red glow. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. I was sure we weren't supposed to leave. "Most of the staff are gone," she panted. "It's not safe here." I glanced around. Kids my age and a few older teens stepped out of their rooms, confusion on their faces. Some were crying, some were too scared to speak. I spotted a tall boy named Ashton, who was rumored to have done something worse than me. We locked eyes for a moment. He looked just as startled as I felt. The nurse kept ushering us forward. "Stay together. We'll head toward the staff exit. Security is left. We can get out." "Are there any staff still here?" I asked, forcing the words out. Her eyes darted behind us. "Dr. Whitley. She tried to call for help. I'm not sure." Suddenly, footsteps pounded at the far end of the corridor. A shape rounded the corner. We couldn't see who it was in the dim light. The nurse froze, lifted her arms in front of her like a flimsy shield. Then the shape raced forward, a staff member, face contorted in panic. She stumbled, fell, and tried to stand again. But she was tackled from behind by another figure that sprinted too fast, too stiff. All we could make out was the faint silhouette as it pinned her to the floor. I heard her scream, then nothing. "Run!" the nurse shrieked. We sprinted past the pinned staff member, eyes averted, hearts hammering. There was a metal gate halfway down the next corridor, used to keep residents in place whenever a security alert was issued, but it stood half open, locked at an awkward angle. A second nurse knelt by the control panel, desperately hitting buttons that no longer worked. The overhead alarm's red glow made the entire hallway look drenched in some kind of haunting filter. "They cut the power to the gates," the second nurse whispered, wiping sweat from her brow. "I can't open it fully." "Then we'll squeeze through," the first nurse said. One by one we slipped through the narrow gap. A few of the older kids offered to help push and pry it wider, but it was stuck fast. Suddenly, we heard that same stumbling gait behind us. We could see the shape of something creeping closer. The first nurse shouted, "Move! Move!" I slid through the gate just as a moan rippled through the corridor. My heart pounded so loudly that I couldn't hear anything else, but what I glimpsed in that moment was burned into my mind forever. Pale skin, sunken eyes, an expression devoid of humanity. It lunged forward as if drawn by the slightest sound. We dashed into the next corridor. Beyond the corridor was an outdoor courtyard. Rain drizzled from the sky, and in the gloom, I could make out several sets of footprints in the mud. Some belonged to staff who had attempted to flee earlier. I saw footsteps that vanished near the high perimeter fence. A few paper documents were soaked and plastered to the ground, swirling in small puddles. The nurse led us toward a large side gate that opened out to the staff parking lot. In normal circumstances, it was guarded by a heavy security presence. Now only emptiness greeted us. The gate stood cracked open. Outside, one flickering streetlight revealed a city skyline tinted with an ominous glow. I swallowed the lump in my throat. This was it. The boundary. The line I was never supposed to cross without an escort. The staff always told me that to leave without permission meant more charges, more locked doors. But the facility had collapsed. Nothing seemed to matter. A part of me felt almost dizzy with the possibility of stepping beyond the gates, truly free for the first time in many months. A second part of me remembered that I was a murderer, and no matter what happened out there, that fact wouldn't change. We pressed forward. Our shoes crunched broken glass near a guard booth. The small booth's door hung wide open. Something had forced its way inside, leaving deep marks in the metal. The nurse guided us into the parking lot, scanning for any running vehicles or staff members. Some of the older teens began shouting for help, but the nurse frantically waved at them to be quiet. "You don't want to attract attention," she hissed. That's when we heard it. A low, rasping moan echoing off the concrete walls. It was close, too close. From behind a row of parked cars, 4 shapes emerged. They stumbled in unison, arms dangling oddly at their sides. My heart lurched at the sight of their vacant expressions. The nurse gasped and pressed a hand over her mouth. None of us wanted to acknowledge what they really were. We'd heard the rumors, but seeing them in person was different. They weren't in any hurry. They moved slowly, but with an unsettling purpose. The group of kids took an instinctive step back. I felt Ashton, the tall boy, at my side. He muttered, "We have to go around them." The nurse nodded quickly and pointed in the opposite direction. But we only made it a few steps before we realized there were more of those figures behind us, staggering from the shadows. They formed a sort of half-circle, cutting off our escape routes. Without warning, one of the older teens panicked. He bolted between 2 cars and sprinted toward the fence. The nurse called after him, but he kept running. A shape lurched out from behind the fence, catching him off guard. I turned away before I could see what happened next. "As quietly as you can," the nurse whispered, pointing at an opening to a side road near the edge of the lot. "We'll slip through there." We moved carefully. The shapes in the parking lot seemed to have trouble moving quickly, so we hoped to get around them unseen. I forced myself not to look back at the teen who had run. Deep down, I knew I couldn't save him. We wove between parked cars, keeping low. My breath thundered in my ears. At one point, I glanced through a car window and saw the keys hanging from the ignition. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe we could drive away. But I was 15. I didn't know the first thing about driving. Eventually, we made it to the side road's tall fence. The nurse and Ashton helped pull the chain-link gate aside, giving just enough room for me and another kid to slip through. Only after we were all out did I finally notice how quiet the city seemed. No distant hum of traffic. No horns. No voices. Just a low breeze and the occasional moan. We ventured onto the main street and saw flickering lampposts. Some storefronts had their lights on, but the windows were shattered. Vehicles sat abandoned, doors open, as if the drivers had fled. The entire area felt like a ghost town, with curtains in broken windows swaying in the wind. We huddled together near the curb. scanning for a path forward. I still stuck close to the nurse. She was our only real tether to the world of adults. Then I caught sight of a distant group, maybe half a block away. At first I hoped they were survivors, but the way they moved in fits and starts told me otherwise. They were more of the infected, drifting aimlessly among the deserted cars. The nurse motioned for us to stay quiet, guiding us around the corner. We walked in single file, trying not to draw attention. At every sound, we jumped. Broken glass was everywhere. An overturned trash bin spilled its contents across the sidewalk. Finally, we saw a tall office building with a side door slightly ajar. The nurse held up a hand, indicating we should investigate. With a trembling push, Ashton shoved the door open further. Inside was a dark hallway with a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. "Let's get inside," the nurse whispered. "We can regroup and make a plan." We slipped in, one by one, until the last of us was safe behind the door. The building's lobby was dim, shadows stretching across old tile floors. Chairs stood in disarray, as if people had abruptly pushed them aside. A front desk with a computer lay empty. The nurse found a small storeroom near the lobby entrance. She ushered us in, saying we should stay quiet until we were certain it was safe. There were about 8 of us total. Me, Ashton, a couple of kids around my age, and a few older teens. One had a bandaged arm from a recent fight in the facility. Another kept glancing around with wide, frightened eyes. We sat on the cold floor. Our breathing felt loud in the silence. "Does anyone have a phone?" Ashton whispered. A few kids checked pockets, but none of us had personal devices. The nurse frowned. The staff phones were lost in the chaos. My phone was in my locker. "How can we get help?" someone asked. She hesitated. "I'm not sure if there's anyone to call. The city, I think it's been quarantined. We're on our own." The group fell silent. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my thoughts. Images of the facility's corridors kept coming back to me. The flickering lights, the vacant stare of the infected. Even more than that, I remembered the reason I ended up locked away. What if the world had no place for me now? What if my past labeled me forever? After some time, the nurse cleared her throat. "We can't stay here long. We need supplies, food, water, maybe a radio. We should find somewhere more secure. Then we can wait until this situation is under control." Ashton nodded. "There's probably a grocery store a few blocks south." "It's too dangerous," someone else argued. The nurse sighed. "We don't have a choice. We'll have to move carefully and avoid large groups of those things. If we stick together, we might stand a chance." While we rested in that storeroom, my mind strayed to the moment that upended my life. I had hurt someone badly. They didn't survive. The details aren't necessary, but it's haunted me ever since. I know many people believe I deserve whatever fate comes to me. Maybe they're right. When I found myself trembling against the wall in that dark building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd be safer if I were alone. Not because I didn't need help. No, I wanted to stay with these people. But maybe they wouldn't want me around if they knew exactly what I'd done. At the facility, everyone was labeled. One kid was rumored to have set fires. Another was rumored to be part of a group that got into serious trouble. We all had our secrets. Mine was heavier than most. But in this new, broken world, none of that seemed to matter to the infected. If they saw you, they came at you with the same mindless hunger, no questions asked. They didn't know who I was or what I'd done. I was just another living, breathing person. The nurse didn't care about my file either. She only saw a kid who needed help. And I wondered if maybe the biggest difference between me and those infected was that I still had a choice to make different decisions now. After a short rest, the nurse insisted we continue. The building felt too risky, an enclosed space with many doors and hiding spots for zombies. She opened the storeroom door a crack and peeked out into the lobby. "All clear," she mouthed. We carefully made our way through the dark halls, stepping around scattered office chairs. We found a side entrance that led to an alley. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling debris and paper across the ground. A few blocks down we could see the glow of a supermarket sign, but the rest of the street was cloaked in darkness. "Let's go," the nurse whispered. We formed a makeshift line, hugging the walls. Every sound put us on edge. A loud crash made us freeze, but it turned out to be a loose metal sign. The tension was unbearable. As we turned the corner, I saw movement near a bus stop. A group, maybe 6 or 7, were standing. I couldn't tell if they were survivors or infected. Then they moved, and the unmistakable, jerky swaying posture revealed the truth. We waited until they were far enough away before tiptoeing along a row of cars. My heart hammered in my chest, threatening to burst. The grocery store's parking lot was in disarray. Abandoned cars, smashed windows. The main doors looked open. One glass panel had been shattered entirely. We hurried towards the building. Inside the grocery store, most of the aisles were dark. Some emergency lighting still flickered, revealing empty shelves. It seemed like the place had been picked over. There were scattered items on the floor, a few spilled cartons. Yet we found a small area near the back where canned goods had been left behind. While the nurse and a couple of older teens went to find a flashlight, I stumbled upon a half-open storage closet. Inside were boxes of bottled water, presumably overlooked in the panic. I called for Ashton, and we managed to carry several bottles back to the group. A few other kids rummaged for snacks that weren't stale. We all congregated in the center of the store, near the produce section. The nurse passed around the water. Everyone drank greedily. My throat felt raw and sore from nerves and lack of water. Then Ashton offered me a bag of chips. I realized I was starving. I tore it open, thankful for the bland but comforting taste. It was a quiet moment in a storm of chaos. 8 kids and a nurse, gathered in the half-lit remains of a grocery store. For a split second, I almost forgot the world outside. Then the lights flickered, and one of the big overhead windows near the entrance rattled. Something was there. A moan drifted through the broken glass. The infected had wandered in, drawn by our movement or the rustling of plastic bags. Silhouettes loomed at the entrance. 1, 2, maybe 5 or 6. The group collectively tensed. The nurse gestured for us to stay behind her as she took a slow step toward the aisle. We tried to stay perfectly still, hoping the infected would stumble by without noticing us in the dim light. But then a younger teen accidentally kicked a fallen can. The metallic clank echoed through the store. Instantly the silhouettes jerked in our direction. Several of them broke into a stiff, unnatural run. "Back!" the nurse whispered, then louder. "Back! Run!" We bolted deeper into the store, weaving between aisles. The infected lurched after us, their limbs swinging strangely. We could hear them behind us, knocking over displays and scattering debris. One older teen tripped over a toppled trash bin. Ashton helped him back to his feet. Meanwhile, the nurse tried to lead us toward an exit sign at the rear of the store. My stomach clenched as the footsteps and moans grew closer. We dashed through the stockroom door, pushing it shut behind us. There was no lock, just a broken latch. Ashton and I pressed our bodies against it, trying to hold it closed as the infected pounded from the other side. "Move! We need another way out!" the nurse gasped. A narrow hallway led to a service elevator. Another sign indicated a set of stairs. "This way!" I shouted, pointing to the stairs. The group rushed down a flight that led to a loading dock. The door was locked with a heavy chain. One of the older kids used a broken piece of metal to pry at it while we waited, hearts pounding. Behind us, the door upstairs burst open. We heard scraping footsteps. "Hurry!" The chain snapped, and the door to the loading dock swung outward. We rushed through, stepping onto a concrete ramp that led to the outside alley. We stumbled into the night, breath ragged, hearts racing. A few infected milled around the far end of the alley, but they hadn't spotted us yet. We took a chance and sprinted in the opposite direction, ducking behind dumpsters, weaving through the narrow path. Finally, We emerged onto another street lit by sporadic street lamps. Everyone looked exhausted. The nurse nearly collapsed, and we helped her to a bench. In that moment, feeling my chest burn from the run, I understood that every living human was fighting the same battle now, regardless of their past. We were all just trying to survive. But I couldn't ignore the truth. I was a murderer. I'd taken a life, and no outbreak could erase that. In the old world, that meant I was locked up. In this new world, it seemed nobody cared anymore. I caught Ashton glancing at me. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yeah." "You're not," he said. "None of us are." I shook my head. I guess I'm not used to all this." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Who is?" We both stared down the dark street. Broken glass glimmered under a streetlight. In the distance, shapes wandered aimlessly. Once she caught her breath, the nurse stood, looking pale but determined. "We need to find somewhere to stay for the night. A building with only 1 or 2 entrances, somewhere we can block them off." We pressed forward, searching the darkened city blocks. Eventually, we spotted a large church with thick wooden doors. The windows were high, stained glass mostly intact. It seemed safer than the other options we'd passed. We approached the churchyard. The fence was locked, but Ashton scaled it, dropping down on the other side. He pushed from within and managed to unhook a rusted latch. The gate opened with a creak. We hurried toward the church door. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had forced it open. Inside, the main hall was deserted. A few broken pews lay scattered, but the sturdy doors could be barricaded. The nurse and a couple of the older teens moved around the church, securing doors and checking for hidden infected. They returned looking relieved. "Seems clear. Let's settle here for a while. We can rest and figure out our next move in the morning." And so we did. We used chairs and a few heavy objects to block the doors. We found a couple of candles near the altar, which gave us a little light. Everyone huddled together. But a few hours later, I woke to see that the nurse was gone. So were 2 others. A soft breeze drifted in through the side door, which was left slightly open. I had no idea where they went or why. For a moment, I wondered if she was trying to find help, or if she'd lost hope, or maybe something had lured them outside. None of us knew. We waited, but she never came back. We searched the surrounding hallways in the church, calling her name in hushed tones. We found no trace of her or the others, only that open door at the side, leading into the dim city. Some of the kids suggested we wait until dawn. Others said we should move on, because we didn't have enough food to stay for long. We voted and decided to stay until sunrise. We reasoned that traveling in darkness was too risky. We took turns keeping watch at the windows, though exhaustion weighed on us. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the infected outside or the guilt that followed me everywhere. Morning light crept through the high windows, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. We noticed faint shapes moving outside the church fence, possibly more infected. They seemed unaware of our presence. We gathered what little supplies we had and prepared to leave. Nobody said it, but we all felt an invisible weight now that our nurse was gone. She was our link to the old world, to the rules and structure we'd once known. We exited through the front door, pushing aside our makeshift barricade. The day was grey and silent, with the city's rooftops bathed in a dull glow. We moved carefully through the courtyard, scanning for threats. As we made our way down the street, we passed cars that had been left in the middle of the road. A few had open doors, but no sign of their owners. Papers fluttered across the asphalt. Occasionally, we spotted 1 or 2 zombies in the distance, stumbling or turning in slow circles. We tried to keep our footsteps quiet. No one spoke. The tension was suffocating, and I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the reason I was locked up in the first place. In the span of a few days, the entire system that caged me had collapsed. I was free now, but did I deserve it? As we moved past a small park, a girl about my age, her name was Sky, fell into step beside me. She looked up with tired eyes. "I've heard rumors about you," she whispered. I stiffened. "And?" "They say you ended someone's life." I didn't reply. I didn't lie either. We kept walking. After a moment, she spoke again. "You did something wrong. So did I. So did Ashton. So did everyone in that building. Doesn't mean we can't try to do better." I took a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can. That kind of thing doesn't go away." She nodded. "But maybe now, in this new world, we can try to help each other." The words sank in. I had no idea what my future held, or if I would even make it through the next day. But it was the first time someone had suggested I might still have a chance at redemption. Some chance to make a different choice than the one I made before. Eventually, our group reached a crossroads. To one side, a stretch of highway led out of the city. To the other, the heart of downtown loomed, where tall buildings stood like silent guardians. We had no idea what lay beyond the city limits, but there was a chance it was less populated and less overrun. Yet downtown might hold rescue centers or emergency aid. Ashton and a few others wanted to head for the highway. They believed we'd find fewer infected out there. Sky and a couple more thought heading into the city center might lead to organized help, military or relief convoys. That left me as the deciding vote. Half the group waited for my answer. I looked at both paths. Each one was uncertain. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. The wind swept dust across the cracked pavement. In the distance, an infected figure shuffled aimlessly by a burnt car. For a moment, I remembered the expression on my victim's face all those months ago, back when everything was normal. The memory stung, and I almost felt unworthy to make such a decision. Then I thought of how the zombie outbreak had leveled all the rules. I was no longer an inmate, no longer bound by society's walls. Did that mean I was free, or just lost? I glanced at the worn, worried faces around me. We were just kids. Well, teens. But we had to decide our fate now. My throat felt tight as I tried to speak. I began, then trailed off. No matter which path I chose, it wouldn't guarantee safety. But we couldn't keep standing there. I turned to them, exhaling slowly. "I think we should—" A low moan rumbled from somewhere behind us. Instinctively, we all turned. Several infected had emerged from a side street, drawn by the sight of us. "Go," Ashton hissed. We broke into a run, hearts pounding, scattering in the direction each of us had last decided. Some sprinted toward the highway, others dashed toward downtown. In the panic, I saw shapes passing me in both directions. For a moment, I froze. Figures stumbled after us, arms outstretched, eyes empty. Their moans echoed. I was a murderer. The old world told me that meant I'd lost my right to live freely among everyone else. Now, in this new reality, everything was inverted. There were no more guards or fences. There was just survival. I looked one last time at Ashton, who waved at me to follow him toward the highway. Sky ran the other way, toward the city's heart. My legs began to move almost on their own. I sprinted, weaving through abandoned cars, ignoring the shouts around me. I vaulted over a low barricade. The infected were close behind, but I couldn't spare a glance. The road stretched out ahead, a strip of asphalt leading into the unknown. Buildings loomed in the other direction, just as dark and uncertain. Behind me, a few zombie figures snatched at the air, but they were too slow. My feet pounded the pavement, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me speed. In that moment, I realized the outbreak had, in a terrible way, given me something I never would have had before. A chance to run free. No more steel bars, no more watchful guards. But I also felt the weight of responsibility. The question throbbed in my mind. What would I do with this freedom? Would I be no better than before, hurting others for my own survival? Or could I redeem myself by protecting those around me, doing whatever I could to help? I glanced over my shoulder, but the small group of infected was falling behind. Ahead, an empty road called me forward. The pounding in my chest reminded me I was still alive, still human. I pushed forward, wind whipping through my hair. A swirl of dust kicked up around me. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but I wasn't sure what came next. Would I find a new life on the highway, away from the city? Would I cross paths with Ashton or Skye again, or anyone else who once shared that facility with me? I didn't know. What I did know was this: I was a murderer. Yet in a twisted turn of fate, the undead had broken the walls around me and set me free. Now I was out in a world where the rules were shattered, and only survival mattered. Maybe I could start over. Maybe I could find a better path. Or maybe I would become a monster worse than any infected. With each step I took down that lonely stretch of asphalt, I felt the burning question growing. Who am I now? I may never know how this story ends, but for the first time in my life, I was free to find out. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.